Have you ever felt like the world's moving too fast to remember what truly matters? In a time when noise gets attention and silence is mistaken for weakness, many of us are still searching for peace, for meaning, for the kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. This story isn't about action, it's about presence. It's about what happens when a man like Chuck Norris chooses to protect something quiet, something good. Stick around. By the end, you might just see influence in a whole new light. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more timeless stories. Chuck hadn't sold a car in 3 weeks. He didn't mind. Most folks thought that was bad for business, but to him this place was never about sales. The showroom stood like an old church made of chrome and wood. It was quiet most days. Just the ticking of a ceiling fan and the slow hum of memories echoing off the polished floor. He'd built it himself, one panel, one shelf, one motorcycle at a time. It used to be a gas station back in the 60s, then a parts garage. Now it was something different, a kind of sanctuary for men like him. Men who weren't quite ready to sit still, but had nowhere else to be. Chuck liked to say that every machine in here had a soul, not because he believed in magic, but because he knew what it meant when someone poured their life into a piece of steel. Some of these bikes had been to war, others had outrun heartbreak. Every scratch, every dent, every modification was a chapter in someone's story. He walked the floor every morning with a cup of coffee in his hand, not the new kind, not a latte or some half-sweet foam drink. Just black, strong and a little bitter, the way mornings used to taste. He didn't listen to music while he worked. The silence had a rhythm of its own. If something creaked, he noticed. If a bike was leaning differently than the day before, he saw it. That attention to detail, that sense of calm presence, it was something he'd earned. Most people forgot he was Chuck Norris, not because they didn't know, but because he didn't remind them. He wasn't trying to be remembered. These days he just wanted to be useful, and in a world full of noise, there was quiet dignity in being useful. Twice a month, he hosted school kids from the East Side, a small group, always the same non-profit program, always the same 2 teachers, always the same wide eyes. These weren't rich kids, some had never left their block. But when they walked through the glass doors and saw those gleaming motorcycles lined up like artwork, something changed in them. They stood straighter, their eyes widened, and most of all, they listened. Chuck never gave speeches. He didn't hand out flyers or push lessons. He just told stories. Stories about the bikes, where they came from, and about the people who once held the handlebars like they were holding a lifeline. The kids soaked it in. Every pause, every turn of phrase, every quiet moment, Chuck would stop, let the weight of a story settle in, and then move on like nothing had happened. That morning, the sun came in just right through the tall windows. It lay long shadows across the floor. The kids were coming at 10, but Chuck had been up since 5. Habit. He didn't sleep much anymore, not because of bad dreams, just didn't need to. Some days the past walked with him like an old friend, and they'd sit in the dark until morning came. He wiped down the 1943 Indian Chief. It was a real one, used in World War II. He kept it just as it was, battle-worn. The dent is in the gas tank, and there is rust on the kickstand. He never cleaned it too much. The story was in the paper. At exactly 10, the bus pulled in. He recognized the driver. Same as always. The kids filed out one by one, holding their sack lunches and whispering to each other, like this place was a library made of leather and steel. Their teacher, Miss Hargrove, smiled and waved. Chuck nodded. No big greetings, just a familiar look between 2 people who knew what this was. He opened the door wide and stepped back. The kids walked in. One boy gasped. Another pointed at a chopper in the corner like it was a spaceship. Chuck let them look. He gave them a few minutes just to breathe it in. Then he motioned toward the old chief and began the story. This one belonged to a man named Carl who was stationed in Normandy. Chuck didn't tell them about the blood or the bullets. He told them about the ride home, about how Carl got off the boat, bought a bottle of soda, and rode that bike across 6 states before he ever told his family he was alive. The kids listened like it was a movie. Then one boy asked, did he ever ride it again? Chuck said no. He kept it though, parked it in his garage for 40 years. Then one day he gave it to Chuck, with a note that just said, I'm finally ready to let go. The room went quiet for a second. That kind of stillness only happens when young minds feel something real. Then a little girl raised her hand and asked if any of the bikes were Chuck's. He smiled, walked them to the far wall, pointed at a red 1968 Triumph with faded paint and a seat patched in 2 places. This one, he said, saved my life once. Not because it was fast, but because it gave me a reason to get up again. As he spoke, something strange happened. A sound from outside, low, slow. A deep vibration that didn't match the peaceful rhythm of the morning. Chuck's head turned. He knew that sound. Not just the kind of engine, but the kind of presence it brought. 6 motorcycles rolled up to the lot. Not kids, not weekend riders. These men moved together like a unit, like a pack. And the way they parked, deliberate, silent, tight, said everything Chuck needed to know. These weren't customers. The lead rider removed his helmet. He had a sharp jaw, grey eyes, and a scar just below his left ear. His hair was tied back. Not wild, but controlled. This man had seen things, done things. He didn't smile. Chuck stepped outside, closed the door behind him. The man looked at him and asked if he was the owner. Chuck nodded, said yes. The man said he was looking for a bike, a very specific one. Chuck didn't blink. He said, which one? The man pointed through the glass, to the far side of the showroom, toward a dark blue Harley shovelhead with gold trim and a single brass emblem on the gas tank. Chuck looked at it, then back to the man. He asked, and who did it belong to? The man said his brother, Caleb. Chuck didn't answer right away. That name dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. The man went on. Caleb had died 3 years ago. Left no will, no property, no instructions. Just that bike. And a memory too heavy to carry alone. Chuck looked him in the eye. That bike had shown up one night. No note, no knock, just parked at the back of the showroom with a key taped to the seat and a single piece of paper that read, "Keep it safe. Don't let my brother find it yet." Chuck kept it. Never talked about it. Now the brother had come. The kids inside were watching from the window. Miss Hargrove moved them away, but not before they saw something shift in Chuck's shoulders. Not fear, just something heavy. Chuck said the bike was still here, safe, but it wasn't ready to be handed over yet. The man's jaw tightened. Not with anger, with years. He asked, "Why not?" Chuck didn't answer. Instead, he asked the man to come back later, after hours, alone. He looked him straight in the eye and said, "There's a story that comes with that bike, and it ain't yours yet." The man didn't argue. He looked at Chuck like a man who had heard those words before, just not from someone who meant them. Then he turned to leave. His crew followed. No burnouts, no threats. Just that same slow rumble disappearing into the Texas horizon. Chuck stood there long after the dust settled. He looked back at the kids, then back on the bike. The past was circling back, and this time it wasn't asking politely. But for now, he had a story to finish. He walked back in, nodded to the class and said, "Now, let me tell you about the one that got away, but didn't stay gone." And the kids leaned in again, just like they always did. The sun had already started to dip behind the ridge when Chuck locked up the showroom. The light had that kind of burnished gold quality that only shows up for 15 minutes at the end of a long, dry Texas day. It was the kind of evening that made you think about everything you never said out loud. Chuck stood on the front steps with his hands in his pockets. He could still feel the weight of that name hanging in the air, Caleb Rayner. That name had no business being spoken aloud after all these years, not in this place, not today. He had hoped the past would stay parked right where he left it, but memories have wheels, and sooner or later, everything catches up. He moved back inside, turned off the overhead lights, and let the warm glow from the windows fill the room. It was quieter now, just the tick of the old wall clock and the subtle creak of cooling engines. The kids were long gone. Miss Hargrove had given him a look on the way out. Not worried, just curious. She knew something had shifted. Chuck walked to the back of the shop, past the rows of bikes, past the Triumph with the patched seat, past the silent weight of stories that lived in gas tanks and tire treads. He stopped at the blue Harley. It sat, like it always had, balanced, unmoving. But tonight, it looked different, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. He reached out and touched the seat. The leather was worn but smooth. Familiar. He could still remember the day it showed up. No call, no knock, just there, like a ghost that didn't need permission. Chuck didn't move it, didn't register it, just left it as it was, part respect, part fear, mostly because of the note. 5 words, written in the same hand he hadn't seen in over 3 decades. Keep it safe. Not yet. There had been no return address, no date, just a signature. Caleb. Chuck didn't sleep that night. He sat in the shop near the Harley with a black and white photo in his hand. It was old, folded too many times. It showed 2 young men in military fatigues standing in front of a wall somewhere in Beirut. One had his arm around the other. They both looked like they hadn't slept in a week. Or peace in a year. Caleb had that grin, that sideways smirk that made you think he knew something you didn't. He usually did. Chuck remembered the mission, remembered the decision, remembered walking away. That's the thing about some regrets. They don't shout. They just sit, quiet, waiting, until something opens the door. At exactly 8:35, headlights appeared on the gravel road. One bike. The rumble was lower this time. Slower. No backup. Just the man from earlier. Alone. He cut the engine and stepped off. The silence between them stretched wide, but neither of them rushed. Chuck unlocked the front door and pushed it open, then stepped aside and let him in. The man nodded once. Not thanks, just an acknowledgement. They understood each other in a way that didn't require extra words. Inside, the room felt heavier. The man looked around, took it in slower this time, less like a hunter, more like a student walking into a classroom he'd never thought he'd sit in. Chuck gestured toward the back, then walked that way. The man followed. They stopped in front of the Harley. It gleamed under the low light, but not in a flashy way, more like a quiet monument, like a headstone you polish out of love, not obligation. Chuck folded his arms, took a breath. He said he owed the man an explanation, maybe more than one. The man said he wasn't there for apologies, he was there for the truth. Chuck nodded, said that was fair. He started slow. Caleb had saved his life more than once, not just physically, but in ways hard to name. They were brothers in everything but blood, trained together, bled together. Laugh the kind of laugh you only earn after facing real darkness. Then came the mission. Chuck's orders were simple. Pull out, secure the perimeter, wait for the call. The call never came. By the time he went back in, it was chaos, bodies, smoke, and Caleb, dragged out with half his unit gone. They blamed Chuck, and he didn't fight it. Because deep down, He blamed himself too. After that, Caleb vanished, went off the grid. No messages, no updates. Just gone. Until the bike showed up. Chuck paused. Let the words sink in. The man stayed quiet. Chuck said he didn't reach out because he didn't know if he had the right or the courage. He said he kept the bike because he believed it was more than a machine. It was a message, maybe even a test. The man finally spoke. He said Caleb never talked about the mission, not directly, but in the last few years he'd begun to write letters, notes, scribbles in notebooks that no one saw until after he died. In one of them, he'd written 5 words. He's still holding it for me. That's when the man knew Chuck had the bike, knew he had to come, not to fight, but to finish what was unfinished. Chuck looked at him, saw the weight in his shoulders, the same kind he carried. He said they could keep talking, or they could just sit with it for a minute. So they did. The 2 men stood there, in the soft light, with the smell of oil and dust and time. After a while, Chuck walked to a small cabinet, took out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to the man. Inside was a worn leather pouch. Inside that, a folded note. Caleb's handwriting, the last one he sent. The man unfolded it, read it, then read it again. Chuck didn't ask what it said. He didn't need to. The man folded it back up, slower this time, then looked at the Harley. He ran a hand over the tank. His fingers brushed the emblem. Then he turned to Chuck and asked something simple. Was he a good man? Chuck answered without thinking. He was better than I. The man didn't argue. He nodded once, then stood for a long time. Eventually he turned back toward the door, but before he left he asked Chuck if he could do one thing. Started. Chuck looked surprised, then walked over, flipped the choke, turned the key. The bike roared to life, deep, clean, like a memory waking up. The man closed his eyes for a second, took it in. Then he opened them, looked at Chuck one more time, and said something soft. Thank you for not selling it. Chuck just nodded. After the man left, Chuck stood there with the engine still purring. He reached down, turned it off. Silence returned, but it felt different now, like something had finally shifted. Maybe, just maybe, the past didn't have to stay stuck in reverse. Chuck sat down next to the bike. He didn't feel lighter, not quite, but he did feel honest, and that was enough for one night. The next morning Chuck woke early, but this time not from habit. Something inside him was unsettled, not anxious, not afraid, just aware, like an internal clock ticking down to something unnamed. He stood in the kitchen of the small apartment above the showroom, drinking his coffee more slowly than usual. The air felt heavier today, even though the sun was out and the sky was clear. Downstairs, the Harley sat exactly where it had been the night before, but now it seemed different. Not like it was waiting anymore, but like it had done its part, like it had delivered a message. Chuck stood in front of it for a few minutes in silence. He thought about all the things he hadn't said. About Caleb, about the man who walked in last night with the weight of a legacy he never asked for. He didn't know if the man would come back. He hadn't said he would, but Chuck had learned something long ago. When someone walks away quietly, they might be carrying more than just their own story. He opened the doors to the showroom around 10. It was a slow day, no tours planned, just a few old regulars who stopped in now and then. Men who didn't say much but liked being around things that reminded them of when the world made more sense. One of them, Joe Ramirez, walked in around noon with a paper bag of donuts. He always brought the kind with cinnamon, said they were good for your soul. Chuck and Joe didn't talk much. They usually stood near the bikes, leaning on the counter, sharing the kind of silence that comes with age. Today was different. Joe glanced at the Harley, then looked back at Chuck. That one's got some miles in its eyes, Joe said. Chuck just nodded. You ever notice, Joe continued, some machines carry grief better than people do? Chuck smiled a little but didn't answer. Later that afternoon, while wiping down the handlebars of a '67 Bonneville, Chuck heard the bell at the front door. He looked up expecting one of the neighborhood kids, maybe someone wanting to borrow a tire gauge or just ask about horsepower. But it wasn't a kid. It was her. She looked maybe 45, sharp but not flashy, dressed in jeans and a dark jacket. Sunglasses are in one hand and a small envelope is in the other. She didn't introduce herself, just asked if he was Chuck Norris. He said yes. She stepped forward and handed him the envelope. This is from Caleb, she said quietly. Chuck took it, surprised. He asked, Are you family? No, she said, just someone who knew what he was trying to make right before the end. She didn't stay, just nodded once and walked out. Chuck didn't stop her. Some people are only meant to be messengers. He opened the envelope inside the office. The paper inside was yellowed, folded twice, and the edges were worn. Caleb's handwriting again, no greeting, no goodbye, just one sentence. You did what you could. I know that now. Chuck sat down. The words hit harder than expected. Not because they were poetic or profound, but because they were enough. He didn't need an apology or a confession. He needed someone to say it wasn't all on him. And now, that weight shifted just a little. He put the letter away and returned to the floor. A few hours passed. The shop stayed quiet. Then, at around 5:30, the front door opened again. It was the man, Caleb's brother. This time, he came alone again, but his shoulders were different, lighter, maybe. He didn't look around like before, just walked straight to the Harley and stood in front of it. Chuck came over and asked if he wanted to take it. The man looked at the bike, then shook his head. He said, I thought I did, but I think it belongs here. Chuck didn't push. The man continued, saying that Caleb wasn't just trying to hide the bike, he was trying to leave a message. He knew I'd come. He wanted me to meet you, to hear it straight. Chuck said, And did you? The man nodded. I did. And I think I finally understand him. They stood together for a long moment. Two men are not saying everything, but saying enough. Then the man asked something unexpected. He said, Can I ride it? Just around the lot, one time. Chuck didn't hesitate. He handed him the keys. The man climbed on, settled in like he'd done it 1,000 times, even though Chuck knew this was the first. He started the engine. It purred steadily and deeply. He took one slow lap around the showroom lot. Nothing dramatic, no speeding, just motion, like he was letting something move through him. When he returned, he turned off the bike, got off, and stood in front of it, like a man closing a chapter. Chuck stepped forward. The man handed back the keys, but not with sadness. He said, I came here looking for a bike. I'm leaving with something else. Chuck nodded. What's that? The man looked around, at the bikes, the windows, the light coming through the dust. He said, Perspective. They didn't shake hands, didn't hug, just a look, an understanding. That was enough. As the man walked back to his motorcycle, Chuck called out. What was his name? The man looked back, smiled. Jonas. Then he put on his helmet, started his bike, and rode away. No roar, no rush. Just one clean line into the fading sun. Chuck watched until the bike disappeared from view. Then he turned, looked back at the Harley, and took a deep breath. There was nothing flashy about this moment. No music swelled, no revelation, just peace, quiet, earned and steady. He walked back into the shop, turned off the lights, and sat beside the Harley. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was guarding something. He felt like he was sharing it. That made all the difference. It was the quiet that settled first. Not the silence of an empty room, but the kind that comes after something true has been said. The kind that doesn't ask for more words. Chuck sat with it for a while, alone in the dim light of his showroom. Outside, the last rays of sun stretched long across the concrete, drawing shadows from the bikes parked inside. The Harley sat just a few feet away. It didn't seem like an object anymore. It felt like a presence. A witness to a history that had finally found its voice. Chuck wasn't sure if he felt lighter or simply clearer. Some truths don't lift you, they just let you stop carrying something that never belonged to you. He stood, stretched his back and walked to the front windows. The streets were quiet. That old Texas evening hush had returned, the kind of stillness that makes people remember their fathers, their old homes, a world that moved a little slower. He glanced at the small calendar by the door. The next school visit was in 5 days. The kids would come again. Some of them are new, some of them are returning. He wondered if he should finally tell them Caleb's story. Not all of it, just the part that mattered, about how some promises take longer to keep, and how sometimes forgiveness doesn't come when you ask for it, but when you're finally ready to understand why you needed it. Later that night, he sat in his office, flipping through an old ledger. Inside were notes on every bike in the shop. Where did it come from? Who had owned it? What repairs were made? Most pages were detailed. Then he got to the Harley. There wasn't much written, just 2 lines. Received late, no name, hold. He took out a pen and added something beneath it. Returned, story told. He paused before closing the book. Then he added one last line. Not all debts are paid in cash. The next morning brought a different kind of air, cleaner, cooler. There was no big change in the sky or wind, but something in Chuck's chest had shifted. He moved through his morning routine like always. Coffee, windows open, lights on, tools in their place. But today, he pulled out a stool and placed it beside the Harley. He sat there for a long time, not doing, just being. Around mid-morning, the front door creaked open. It was an older man, late 60s, maybe 70s, white beard, denim vest, eyes that had seen things but didn't need to talk about them. He looked around and nodded once. Chuck stood and offered him a slow greeting. The man said he used to ride with Caleb a long time ago, not close friends, just the same roads, the same towns, the same danger. He'd heard through someone that Caleb's bike had surfaced here. Said he just wanted to see it one last time. Chuck motioned him over. No questions, no pretense, just space. The man stood in front of the Harley and took off his hat. He didn't speak right away, just stared. Then, in a voice low and slow, he said, Caleb once pulled him out of a bad mess. No glory, no debt, just did it. Chuck asked if he wanted to sit. The man did. They talked for almost an hour. Nothing dramatic, just shared memory. 2 lives that had brushed the same fire without burning the same way. When the man stood to leave, he put his hand on the handlebars. Not tight, just enough to say goodbye. Chuck asked him if Caleb ever talked about regrets. The man nodded. Caleb said he didn't trust many, but he never stopped hoping Chuck would show up one more time. Chuck didn't say anything back, just nodded and walked him to the door. After he left, Chuck opened the side cabinet and pulled out a small black notebook. It had no title, just old pages, worn edges. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were letters, some finished, some not. Most addressed to Caleb, none ever sent. He flipped to the last one. Blank. He took a breath, picked up a pen, and for the first time in decades he wrote. Not out of guilt or shame, but out of something steadier, respect. The letter wasn't long, just enough. He ended it with a line he never thought he'd write. I finally told your story. It landed the way you meant it to. He folded the paper and slid it into the pouch beneath the Harley seat. Not for show, not for anyone else. Just for closure. That afternoon, he cleaned the showroom with more care than usual. He polished the tanks, dusted the old helmets on the wall, lined up the wrenches. Not out of routine, but ritual. As the light softened, he turned the sign to closed and sat by the window. Across the street, a father was teaching his daughter how to ride a bicycle. She wobbled, fell once, then tried again. Chuck watched them for a long time. Something about that moment reminded him why he stayed. It wasn't about bikes, or war stories, or even redemption. It was about presence, about showing up. Because somewhere, someone always needs you to. As the evening deepened, Chuck thought back to a moment long ago, in a camp overseas. A night when he and Caleb sat on top of a sandbag wall and watched the stars. Caleb had said something then, something Chuck hadn't understood until now. We're not made to live forever, but we are made to leave something that might. Chuck thought about those words. About the Harley, about the man who'd ridden away with nothing in his hands but something new in his chest. He smiled, not the kind of smile that comes from winning, the kind that comes from release. Later, before heading upstairs, he walked once more through the showroom. The lights were dim, the floor is quiet. He stopped by the Harley and rested a hand on the seat. No ceremony, no final words. Just that quiet, steady breath of a man who had finally let go of something he didn't even know he was holding. And as he turned out the lights and stepped into the dark, there was no echo, just peace. The next few days passed without much noise. Nothing dramatic, no sudden visitors, no more bikes rolling in with thunder in their engines, just the slow rhythm of daily life returning to Chuck's garage. But it wasn't the same. Not really. Chuck had always believed that peace didn't mean silence. It meant knowing where things belong. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt like it was finally in its place. He woke up early, as usual, brewed the same black coffee, let it sit a few minutes longer than usual. The Texas air was still cool in the mornings. A dry wind blew through the upstairs window, carrying the faint scent of dust and sage. He sat by the counter, sipping slowly, watching the sky turn from silver to gold. Then he stood, stretched his back, and walked down to open the shop. The Harley was still there, but it didn't feel like it needed guarding anymore. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a burden. It had become something else entirely. A story that had been told. A weight that had shifted. Around 10, the front door creaked open. It was Jonas. He stepped in quietly, without his usual edge. Today he carried no tension, no expectations, just a look in his eyes that said he had something to say. Chuck met him near the front counter. No handshake, just that same silent understanding. Jonas looked over at the Harley, then back at Chuck. He said he'd been thinking about it, about what it meant to walk away, about what it meant to stay. He'd spent most of his life chasing answers. Anger had been a compass for too long, but something had cracked open that night in the showroom, not because of what Chuck said, but because of what he didn't say. There had been no blame, no excuses, just presence. A kind of stillness Jonas wasn't used to. He told Chuck he didn't want the bike. He didn't want to take it with him. He said he understood now. The bike wasn't meant to be ridden anymore. It had done its final journey. Chuck nodded. Then Jonas asked if he could leave something behind. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal badge. Not a police badge, not military. It was from a motorcycle club, old, worn at the edges. Chuck recognized the emblem. It was the same one Caleb had worn on a patch decades ago. Jonas said it was the last piece of his brother's life he'd held on to, and now it belonged here, with the story, with the weight. Chuck took it gently and walked over to the Harley. He opened the saddlebag and placed the badge inside, next to the folded letter. When he returned, Jonas had moved toward the door. He turned back once and said something Chuck would carry with him forever. He said he used to think strength was about holding on, but maybe it's more about knowing when to let go. Then he left. Chuck didn't move for a while. He just stood in that same patch of light, feeling the room breathe around him. Then, slowly, he went to the back and pulled out the guest book he kept for veterans who came through. He opened to a blank page and wrote 2 names. Caleb Rayner, Germans Rayner. No rank, no story, just names. Later that afternoon, Chuck cleaned the Harley one more time. Not because it needed it, but because care is how we say goodbye, without words. He ran a soft cloth across the tank, then stepped back and looked at the brass medallion on the side. For the first time in years, it didn't seem like it belonged to someone else. It belonged to the place, to the story. The next day, he set up a small display near the back of the shop. Nothing fancy, just the Harley on a platform, a low sign in front, and a small case with the badge and the letter inside. He didn't want to draw attention. He just wanted to make sure the message was there for whoever needed it. By the time the kids came later that week, it was ready. They entered the showroom like always, wide-eyed, curious, quiet. Miss Hargrove gave Chuck her usual smile and gentle wave. He welcomed them in and pointed to the Indian chief, ready to tell the usual story. But then, for the first time, he paused. He walked them to the Harley. The kids gathered around, their hands behind their backs, listening. Chuck spoke softly, no need to raise his voice. He said, "This bike once belonged to a man who lived a hard life. Not bad, just heavy. The kind of life that leaves dents on the outside and deeper ones on the inside." He told them how that man had sent the bike away, not to forget it, but to keep it safe. Sometimes, what matters most isn't what you carry, but who you trust to carry it for you. He told them about how stories don't always end the day someone is gone. Sometimes they keep going through the people left behind, people who are brave enough to come back, to ask questions, to listen. The kids didn't fidget. They didn't look at their phones. They just stood there, eyes wide, taking in every word. One girl asked if the man had ever come back for it. Chuck said, "Not exactly." But he came back to something more important, the truth. Another boy asked what happened after that. Chuck said, "Peace happened. And sometimes, that's the best ending any of us can ask for." As they left, Miss Hargrove lingered a moment. She looked at Chuck and said the story was different this time. He smiled and said it was ready to be told. After the group left, Chuck sat by the display. A father and son came in later that afternoon. The boy ran straight to the Harley. The father followed, slower, reading the small sign. He asked if it was real. Chuck said yes. The man stared at it for a long time, then turned to Chuck and said he used to ride, a long time ago, but life got in the way. Family, work, fear. Chuck didn't say anything. The man said, "Maybe it's time to get back on. Not to run, just to remember." Chuck nodded, said there was always a place for stories like that. After they left, the shop grew quiet again. Chuck looked around the room. He saw more than bikes. He saw lives, moments, second chances. That night, as he turned off the lights and walked up the stairs, he didn't feel like he was running a business. He felt like he was keeping something alive, something that didn't need fuel or keys, just the truth and the courage to share it. Maybe the most powerful thing about this story isn't the motorcycle or the man who rode it or even the one who let it go. It's the quiet reminder that some things in life don't need fixing, they just need to face. We spend so much time trying to be right, to be strong, to be in control. But sometimes, real strength is showing up. Listening, letting something be said that was never easy to say. For those of us in the second half of life, the question isn't what we've built or accomplished. It's what we're still carrying and what we're finally ready to put down. That could be a regret, a grudge, or even a silence that's lasted too long. Stories like this one help us see those moments. Help us choose a little more presence, a little more peace. So if this story stirred something in you, take a minute. Reflect on what you might still be holding. Maybe it's time to write that letter, make that call, or simply sit with someone and listen without rushing to respond. If you've been through something like this, we'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, ones that remind you who you are and what truly matters, hit like and subscribe. We're building a space for people like you, people who value quiet strength, real connection, and the kind of growth that never goes out of style.